Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm Dr. Robert Childs. For over 4 decades, Dr. Bruce W. Dearstyne has been one of the leading contributors to the study of New York State history. I spoke with Dr. Dearstyne about his latest article for the New York History Journal, the debut of the administrative state in New York, as well as the forthcoming new edition of his book, The Spirit of New York, and his other forthcoming book on the Crucible of Public Policy.
I love talking about New York, New York history. I'm sort of an advocate for New York history.
Welcome to Empire State Engagements. I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Bruce W. Dearstyne. Dr. Dearstyne earned his PhD in history at Syracuse University. He has served on the staff of the Office of State History, was a program director at the New York State Archives for over 2 decades, and has taught history at the University of Albany, SUNY Potsdam, and Russell Sage College. He was also professor of information studies at the University of Maryland, where he directed the History and Library Science graduate program for many years, the program that I often refer to as the employment track graduate program at Maryland. He has written dozens of articles on history, on archives, on libraries, and other related topics. His books include Railroads and Railroad Regulation in New York State, 1903 to 1913. He's co-author of New York, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, which was published in 1990. He is the author of The Spirit of New York, Defining Events in the Empire State's History, which came out from SUNY Press in 2015. He is also author of Leading the Historical Enterprise, Strategic Creativity, Planning, and Advocacy for the Digital Age, also from 2015. His next book, The Crucible of Public Policy, New York Courts in the Progressive Era, is forthcoming this spring, spring of 2022, for those of you watching in the future, from the SUNY Press, and also forthcoming very shortly is an expanded new edition of The Spirit of New York. His most recent article, which will be premiering in the coming weeks from the New York History Journal, is entitled The Debut of the Administrative State in New York, the Court of Appeals Decision That Affirmed Legislative Delegation, and that will be available very soon from New York History, and therefore we recommend that everyone subscribe post haste. That will be the beginning of our conversation, but of course we have a lot to talk about today. So welcome, Dr. Dearstyne. Welcome, Bruce.
Oh, well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor, and thank you for doing this engagements series. It's always good to talk about history, but particularly good to talk about it via Zoom because we can reach so many people.
That's right. Well, it's a wonderful opportunity to get more people, as you say, as the title suggests, engaged with this material. And a lot of it are things that I'm particularly interested in. And that's something I want to start with, actually, is the governor of New York and how that power has changed over the years. Sort of one of the starting points of your new article is the reality that in the early 20th century, in your words, the governor was nominally head of the executive branch, but his appointment of department heads needed Senate confirmation, and departments secured their budgets by lobbying the legislature. Can you shed some light on how that situation, first of all, emerged within New York government and administrative history? And then I think we should chat about, by the time we get to the 20th century, what are some of the practical results of that? But first of all, why such a weak governor?
Well, I think it sort of just evolved from the state constitution of 1777, which created a very strong legislature, a somewhat weaker governor. And during the 19th century, state governments sort of grew haphazardly as the legislature created new departments, added on to other departments, added responsibilities onto other departments, but kind of kept control, meaning they kept control of the budget till Al Smith, about whom you've written, centralized that in the 1920s. They were very emphatic about needing to confirm appointees, and some of the appointees, department heads, were deliberately put in for such terms that they would exceed the governor's term. So a new governor would come in and there'd be holdovers from his predecessor. And budgets had to be negotiated with the legislature. Agencies issued reports, but to the legislature, not the governor. All of that, wasteful, ineffective, kind of haphazard, all of that began to change for the progressives. Theodore Roosevelt a little bit, Charles Evans Hughes, and in a big way with Al Smith, who comes somewhat later. But all of this was a kind of haphazard, inconsistent, a little difficult to describe process. So you mentioned about the implications. If you looked at New York State government at the beginning of the century, you had a Department of Labor, small, kind of sketchy factory laws to enforce, not enough people to do that, and not enough to follow up, and often things just kind of drifted. You had banking and insurance departments, very sparse regulations. Charles Evans Hughes improved that. You had Erie Canal, the state's biggest enterprise. There were at least 3 state agencies which were supposed to watch that. The result was it cost too much. Repairs and enlargements went way over budget, lots of kickbacks, lots of problems, resulting in a number of scandals. There was no education department till 1904. Public health, there was a board of health commissioners, then a commissioner of health, mostly left with the counties and the cities to enforce. So it was kind of a patchwork. And people look back and say, well, it doesn't look like that on the organization chart. It doesn't. That's true. But it was. And the governors, including Charles Evans Hughes, who's kind of the hero of this new chapter, they were immensely frustrated by it. They couldn't control what looked like on paper departments that answered to them. So Hughes in particular had a number of go-rounds with commissioners, holdovers from past governors, who were not doing what they were supposed to do. And of course, a lot of these commissioners were political appointees. They weren't very well qualified. They were well connected politically, but they weren't very well qualified. So that's sort of the setting, the background, the way things look circa 1900. About where my next book starts, and about where the story in this article starts.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I remember years ago reading about Hughes, who, as you said, is sort of the protagonist in this article, and there were just totally incompetent administrators who he just couldn't get rid of. And they were, I think it was, I don't want to say the wrong name, but I think his name was Otto Kelsey, and he was just totally incompetent. But he's some hack, but he's connected to some state senator, and so there's nothing that the governor can do to administer the government, which was incredibly frustrating. And I think where your article and your broader forthcoming book really come in here is, in some ways, how that antiquated government, which maybe you could get away with 80 years earlier, but actually not, because we know there were canal scandals earlier in the 19th century, but maybe you can get away with that in a different time. But changing technological realities, industrial realities, demography, things were moving so fast by the turn of the century that government, the inefficiency was even more frustrating, wasn't it?
No, I think that's well put. It almost seems to me like New York suddenly went on fast forward about 1900, and things had kind of drifted. They were okay in the past. They've been satisfactory. Nobody cared too much. They suddenly began to matter a lot, and that's where the progressives kind of step onto center stage, because they want some new departments. Excuse me. They want to consolidate old departments. They want to strengthen things. And basically, they want the government to step in and, without going too far, kind of make sense out of all of this. Stand up for the people against the vested interests. That leads to things like the direct primary movement, to get political control away from the political bosses, more back with the people themselves. And it leads to many of the things that Charles Evans Hughes and others were trying to do, about bringing a new kind of forceful state government, a much higher presence to the state of New York. As you can imagine, or as you know, or anyone can imagine, I guess, this wasn't easy, because there were holdovers from the old days, there were vested interests, and there were just a lot of people who said, look, we understand we need to change, but not so fast, or we want to go more gradual, or we've got to go exactly by the state and federal constitutions. You courts have got to interpret them very strictly, or else we're going to be careening downhill, and these well-meaning progressives, well-meaning reformers, they'll take over, and things will just be hog wild. So there's a good deal of tension. I think there's a good deal of tension in New York history generally, but in the progressive period, it seemed to me there was more of that than sometimes in the past, maybe than sometimes in the future. And sometimes that would be embodied, that tension, in a single person. One of the people we may talk about later is Alton B. Parker, Chief Judge, Court of Appeals from 1897 to 1904, and then presidential candidate. Well, you can't easily classify him as a conservative or a liberal or a progressive, because at various times he's all of those things. He's pulled one way and pulled the other, and so were the governors, and so to some degree, I think was the legislature. Both parties tended to be pretty conservative. The Republicans a little more reformist than the Democrats, until you get to Al Smith and Robert Wagner about 1911 and thereabouts, and then suddenly it's the other way around. Democrats are more progressive, reform-minded, and so on. But there's very seldom a sudden, like, day to night turnaround in New York. It's kind of a gradual, haphazard, and a little messy and hard to follow. That's what makes history so interesting, I guess, or one of the many things. So.
Well, I completely agree with that. The messiness of the politics in this period is something that I always try to get students to understand when I teach the progressive era. I mean, nationally as well as on a state-by-state and even city-by-city basis, these alliances, these shifting coalitions, the fact that both parties have ultra-conservative wings and progressive wings and something in between, and the messiness of that politics comes through very nicely in your article. And one of the ways we get to that in your article is through public utilities and revelations about corruption from a consolidated gas company that sort of introduce some of these problems. And also there are a lot of diverse political solutions proposed as a result. So talk a bit about that and how it opens up this thing.
Sure. Well, public utilities generally were kind of monopolies or semi-monopolies, such as gas companies, electric companies, and to some degree, railroads and rapid transit lines. So they weren't covered till the Public Service Commission in 1907. And the state had some regulatory authority, but not very much, and you couldn't regulate them by competition because that wasn't feasible. So you had in New York City a company called the Consolidated Gas Company, virtually unregulated, and it raised its rates, its gas and electricity rates, particularly gas. And the newspapers, such as the Hearst papers in New York City and others, were critical of that, and the public was critical of that. And so the legislature came in and said, okay, we will set this at 80 cents per cubic foot, and that will be the right way to do it. But the company said, well, that's not fair, because we want to be able to go up and down as the market changes and our operating costs changes. And so along came William Randolph Hearst, who is an important character in the time I'm writing about, important character in the time you're writing about, in Al Smith's time, who was incredibly important. He was a publisher of the main newspaper in New York City. He was congressman. He ran for president unsuccessfully, didn't get the nomination in 1904. And in 1905, he ran on an independent ticket saying, look, government will take these over. It's almost like a kind of a incipient socialism. We'll run this. And people said, we don't like that. That's socialism. We can't do that. So this whole thing showed the difficulty of non-regulation, light state regulation, or municipal ownership. Now, this got to be such a scandal or so controversial that the New York State Senate, which would just as soon have stayed out of this, they jumped in and they said, we'll investigate. And they needed a lead counsel. This is an interesting story. And somebody knew of this fellow, Charles Evans Hughes. Well, he was kind of almost a bookish guy. He was an ex-professor. He had had big companies as clients in New York City. Top-notch attorney, not a politician, didn't much like politics. Well, they hired him, and he proved to be a brilliant investigator. He interviewed consolidated gas officials on the stand and got them to admit they were overcapitalized, they were charging too much, they were in cahoots with the politicians, and really got himself in the news and proved to be just a brilliant counsel. But then the question came, well, okay, what are we going to do about this? And it was Hughes, with a few other people, who came up with this idea. Look, let's have a very strong regulatory commission. There weren't many precedents for this, as far as I know. Wisconsin had a very strong railroad commission back in 1903, but that was about the only model that was out there. So Hughes came up with this idea of a strong regulatory commission. What I maintain in my article is the beginnings of what we now call the administrative state, meaning the legislature delegated to this new commission, the Gas and Electricity Commission, as it would be called, very strong power, both to make binding rules and to enforce those rules, and to really get almost provide oversight over the companies. How much could they charge? Stocks they could offer, services that they have to provide, and so on. Those sorts of traits would later burgeon in the later progressive period and really in the New Deal period. And they're kind of common today. And if you follow the discussions today, it's always controversial. Administrative state is one of those things that people like to dispute or argue about. But anyway, long story short, Hughes came up with this idea, sold it to the committee he was working for, and to the state senate. And nobody much liked it, but nobody had a better idea. So they passed it in the end, setting up the New York State Commission of Gas and Electricity. That's the topic of the article. Now, most of your listeners probably never heard of that. Well, it was only around for a couple of years before being superseded by an even more powerful commission, actually two commissions, one for basically New York City, one for upstate, public service commissions. But in those 2 years or so, I think it set a number of precedents. It was very cautious about how it approached things. It investigated things thoroughly. The commissioners were nonpartisan. The staff was more than fair. They always held public hearings, and they had a lot of statutory authority behind them, but they exercised it with restraint and judiciously. I think that then proved reassuring to people. Well, look, this will probably work out okay. The legislature became impatient because they weren't changing the rates in New York City, and the fellow who had sponsored the bill, set up the commission, Senator Fred Stevens, actually brought up a bill to abolish it and said, okay, you guys are moving too slow. We, the legislature, will take this back over. And there were hearings on it. And at that point, some of the companies, including Consolidated Gas, came in and said, no, don't do that. We want to take our chances with this commission. They seem to be fair. And as it turned out, the commission set a rate for gas in New York City, which was lower than what the legislature would have said. So it had a pretty good track record. It's kind of a trial administrative state thing, but it had a pretty good track record. But it was challenged in court. And again, this is getting into the article, not by Consolidated Gas, though I think they were maybe egging on these other folks, but by a company in Saratoga Springs, New York, then a village, now a city, where the village had gone in and complained about the rates that the company was charging. Their company was a monopoly, Saratoga Gas and Electric, so it was called for short. And the commission ordered it lowered. Well, the company went into court and said, oh, you're not giving us to make money, but by the way, big deal, this is unconstitutional. You can't do this. Where's it say in the Constitution, state or federal, that you can delegate so much authority to a commission, which was appointed by the governor, had to be confirmed by the Senate, pretty much independent of anybody. So that's the important case that came up before the courts in 1906, 1907, finally decided in 1908. Now, to get ahead of the story a little bit, when it started, the commission was, about a year and a half old, so still pretty new. As it went through the courts, by then Charles Evans Hughes, having been a good investigator in yet another scandal, been elected governor, had proposed the Public Service Commission, which was kind of the Gas and Electricity Commission writ large, if you will, covered railroads, very, very important, even more powerful. And so that finally passed the legislature before the court decided on the Saratoga Gas and Electricity case. So everybody understood, well, if this isn't about the Gas and Electricity Commission anymore, I mean, they're out of business. This is really about the Public Service Commission and administrative state agencies to come. So you had this sort of odd thing where, yes, nominally it was about one company and a commission went out of business. Actually, it was about what are the Public Service Commission, other administrative agencies would be constitutional. In a way, it's kind of a typical New York story. That's odd. The way I related it is odd. The way it relates in the article is odd. It's not neat. It's not sequential. It's not totally logical. But that's the way it was. That's why I maintain, at least, this case was so important.
No, and you really get an excellent sense for that as you read the article, that even though what is being challenged on paper doesn't really exist anymore, the concept is really what's at stake here in the Saratoga case. And actually, so I want to circle back to how that concept fits into other alternatives, but I want to do that after we discuss what actually happened in this case, since we're there. Saratoga Gas and Electric takes this to the courts, and the Supreme Court Appellate Division upheld it by a 3-2, right? So it's a slim margin.
I think so. Yep.
And then they pursued it to the Court of Appeals. There are some interesting characters who emerged during these various cases. One of them is the representative for the gas company, Saratoga Gas and Electric Company, a former Republican state senator, Brackett, and then he is joined by a former Democratic politician, Stanchfield, who I think had run for governor, and then a future Republican gubernatorial nominee, Charles Tuttle. And so that again shows the complex, there are no real partisan lines per se here. What kind of arguments are these guys making? Especially, I mean, Brackett's really breathing fire at some points, but what kind of arguments are they making against this?
Well, yeah, they actually had a stellar cast of attorneys. And toward the end, they were joined by 2 other attorneys supplied by Consolidated Gas, who sort of liked the commission, but weren't sure about this new PSC, Public Service Commission. And so I think we're hedging their bets. And Brackett was from Saratoga. He had been in the legislature when the Gas and Electricity Commission went through. He abstained, thought it gave the governor too much power to make appointments. Then he tried to get a friend appointed to the commission. The governor said, I'm not going to do that. Then he said, okay, I'm going to run for governor. And the Republican Party said, no, you're not. We're going to gerrymander you. So they gerrymandered him out of his seat. I mean, there's kind of a long story about Brackett, because later he came back into the Senate and assumed a leadership role. But I think Brackett was personally annoyed at the way things had gone for him. And so in his documents, in his cases and briefs, and by the way, these are all in the New York State Archives, who I thank very much for giving me access and making it easy to use them. They have a tone to them. It's strident. He said the people behind us are radicals. He called them iconoclasts, not constructionists, which were as fighting words in those days. He said this is part of the passing craze of the hour. But basically, he argued 2 things before the court. One, the rates set are too low. Okay, you, the court, should look into this and increase them. And the courts wisely said, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to look at the hundreds of pages of data. And by the way, the case file for this is over 1,000 pages. We're not going to look at all the hundreds of pages of data you presented. You presented at the Gas and Electricity Commission. That's their job, not ours. Well, that's important, because the courts were saying, we're not going to get into the thicket here of this stuff anymore. We don't have the expertise, we don't have the time, and we don't need the political heat, by the way. So that's the first thing. The second thing was, look, this is unconstitutional. Just like the company said, you can't do this. There's nothing in the state constitution, let alone the federal constitution. But this in turn is more on the state constitution than federal. Nothing there that says the legislature can do this. And the other councils came along and said, yeah, as a matter of fact, the legislature should do this. So if you look at the the Stansfield Tuttle brief, it's very odd. It says the legislature just appoints some committees, and they could set gas and electricity rates for every community in the state. They might be different. And critics said, well, how the dickens could they do that? They can't. They don't have the expertise, don't have the time. So basically, it tried to draw the court into the substance of the issue, was the rate set. Court didn't want to go there. And secondly, it tried to draw the court where the court logically should go and did go into whether this is constitutional or not.
And their arguments seem conservative. Is that fair to classify them? Are they sort of purely, it's not purely laissez-faire, right? Because they're saying that the state legislature can intervene potentially and set rates. Is it more just a reaction against sort of the progressive impulse of executive authority? Is that really the crux of their frustration, or is it this sort of scattershot? They don't like any of this.
Well, that's well put. It's all. It's not neat. It's all of those things. They sort of conceded, yeah, the state can do this because the state incorporated these companies, or they were chartered by local governments, which the state created. So they are, in a sense, maybe a distant sense, the creatures of the state. But only the legislature can do this. I mean, the governor didn't even play into it. Nobody said, well, the governor ought to do this. Legislature can do this. They can do it by law, or maybe the courts can do it by extending what was called the common law, judge-made law. Maybe the courts can do it. But a regulatory commission such as this cannot do it. It's unconstitutional. It puts unelected officials in charge of making important decisions. They're not really accountable to anybody except themselves, maybe indirectly to the governor and legislature, but they're pretty independent. And then another thing that came up here, and I found this several times in the other chapters of my book, almost always at the end is, watch out, this is the entering wedge. If you allow this, they'll be back tomorrow trying to do something else, and they'll never stop. And we are on the road to what? Autocracy, dictatorship, socialism. Socialism was sort of a pejorative term, I guess, in those days. And so this is just the opening door, the entering wedge. You better stop it now. If you look at the cases and briefs, the briefs that were filed, they're not totally consistent. They do have holes in them. They kind of double back on themselves. There are a number of councils involved with this for the company. They're more or less in agreement, more or less coordinated, but not entirely. And it's almost like, as you look back from over 100 years, it's kind of a rearguard action. It's them saying, look, we don't want this. We know we have to have something, but we don't want this. come up with something else. And what they were fighting against, the administrative state or strong regulatory commissions and agencies, was exactly what was going to come in the 20th century. In the progressive period, in the Al Smith period, and the Franklin Roosevelt, who was governor of New York, period here in New York, then in the New Deal, and ever since then. But some of the negatives, if you look at people who even today don't like the quote unquote administrative state, it's kind of the same arguments. You've got agencies here who are kind of above the law, beyond the law. They're making regulations which have the force of law, and they're not our elected representatives, so that doesn't seem right. So it's exactly the way you put it, but some of the arguments against, and a lot of them in favor, kind of defined and gelled right here in this period, and they haven't changed a whole lot, I would say, in 120 years.
Well, that's something that struck me as I was reading this. You know, you could have substituted in the 1920s Bolshevism for socialism, and it's the same arguments. And then in the 40s, it's the road to serfdom, right? There's no, it's a slippery slope, and so you hear those arguments all the way back at this time. What I find interesting about the urgency, you say the angry and alarmist tone of Brackett's arguments in particular, what I find fascinating is that the people like Hughes, who had crafted these new regulatory, the administrative state, and even Hughes's Public Service Commission is more robust, as you point out. They didn't do that because they were looking for some sort of massive government intervention, as much as it seems like they're threading a needle, right? I mean, you've got people like Hearst who really are kind of demagogic and really do want to go all the way, and who knows what he really means, because he has a different opinion every few years. But there are some people who are calling for municipal ownership and who are at the time at least talking the talk of radicalism. And you've got people, the entire Democratic caucus voted against the original bill, right? And then you've got people who are saying, well, we need a sensible sort of systematic approach to real life conditions. And so is it fair to say that politically at this moment, Hughes and others are kind of more a moderate progressivism rather than what Brackett and their opponents characterize them as, or is that too simplistic?
No, I don't think it's too simplistic. It's just right. Moderate progressivism is good. That's a good way to put it. Their critics mischaracterized, exaggerated both their motives, the impact of what they had enacted here, and then the implications for the future. I don't think they did that with some malicious intent, because I've read quite a bit of this. I think they really felt it. They really meant it. But they were also trying to do two things. They're trying to grab the attention of the courts and saying, in effect, look, the legislature passed this, the governor signed it. There's only three branches of government, so you're it. You've got to help it. You've got to tell them to head in. You've got to save it. And to some degree, in some of the cases at least, they're playing for public opinion. Not so much in this, but in some of the later cases, some of the councils actually wrote like letters to the New York Times saying this case is pending. I'm the counsel. We're not trying to influence the court, but here's some reasons why the court should decide this in a certain way. So there are a lot of mixed motives, some inconsistencies. Hughes was I think a moderate fellow. Again, the Public Service Commission, just to jump ahead a little bit, when he appointed the first commissioners, and what I looked at most carefully is upstate, 2nd District, and railroad regulation. They were very moderate fellows, people who were all men in those days. So the first chairperson of the 2nd District Commission, which was just about all in New York State, outside New York City, a guy named Frank Stevens, not Frederick Stevens, who was the legislator. Well, he was the counsel for a branch of the New York Central Railroad. But he turned out to be statesmanlike, even-handed, and his message, and I think to some degree the message of the Gas and Electricity Commission was, look, get your act together. Get your rates consistent. Don't charge rates that you can't justify. Make sure the service is adequate. But to the other side, the public, the message, maybe indirectly, was, look, be patient, be fair. We're not going to, and you don't want something that's confiscatory, because if you do that, you simply put the companies out of business, and they are serving you. So there's quite a bit of literature about Theodore Roosevelt, some of the things that he wrote, some of the things he said, the way he put things. I'm standing in the middle between these contending forces, and I'm urging patience, steadfastness, coming together, reconciliation, compromise. Way out on this end are the radicals, the socialists, the Hearsts, and others. And out on this end, way on the extreme, are the laissez-faire people. They say, don't do anything. We're trying to get something sort of in the middle, moderate, reasonable, something that's going to work. In this case, in New York State, but the progressives would say at the national level and for the United States generally. So yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Not as neat, clean, and clear cut as we might like. That's why it's so interesting, but also so hard to describe this stuff clearly.
Well, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the reality is things had gotten so out of hand by the late stages of the 19th century, by the turn of the century, the sort of the excesses of the Gilded Age, that if you were sensible and a business person, a railroad lawyer or the Consolidated Gas Company, you might be hearing the clamoring for a more radical approach coming from the Hearsts of the world and say, boy, this commission doesn't look so bad. We can, and you see a lot of that in your article, which I think is effective.
No, I think that's well put. It's true of this commission, true of the Public Service Commission, which was its successor, where the railroads more or less decided they'd rather have that than the legislature. Every year, there were bills that were brought in to find the railroads. Service wasn't good enough, full crew bills to make them put more crew members on, safety bills. And sometimes they said, look, let's not do this anymore. This Public Service Commission, they seem fair, we'll trust them. I think utilities, seeing the Gas and Electricity Commission, its predecessor, less than 2 years, seeing that it was seen to be moderate, fair, it investigated, it was professional, it was nonpartisan, it tended to listen and hold hearings, gradually were won over by the evidence they saw right in front of them that this is probably going to work. There wasn't anything else on the horizon that seemed better, so this seemed okay.
I'm interested also in the arguments being made on behalf of the commission because again, it's a sort of three-headed defense team, right? You've got the state attorney general, who Jackson was a Democrat who wasn't even, as you point out, a fan of the commission to begin with, but he's sort of dutifully, well, I'll let you describe his work. And then you've got the village attorney from Saratoga Springs is there, and lawyers from the new PSC, right? So that sort of reveals that they recognize what's at stake because they're sending lawyers to technically defend something else. How did they coordinate? Did they have different arguments? And also, as you went through the documents, did you get a sense that they were maybe working at cross purposes, or did they get along? I don't know if that comes through in the archives, but what was the defense of the law? What did that look like?
Well, I don't know if they ever sat down in the room and coordinated, but they certainly got along. They probably talked by U.S. mail or maybe by telephones or whatever. And their arguments in favor of the constitutionality of the gas and electricity law, which by them was increasingly a stand-in for the Public Service Commission law, were pretty consistent. So if you look at the briefs in Saratoga Springs, early on there, here's all this data about why we should be making more money, and then toward the end, the courts are saying, well, we don't want to, that's not out for us to look at. The commission looked at that. We just are interested in process and constitutionality. Toward the end, the briefs they're shorter and they're very simple. Look, here's the point. By then, I think the village was sort of playing for public opinion, maybe to some degree. The Attorney General is interesting because he had opposed the Public Service Commission law. He said, look, if we're going to have this, they have to be elected, not appointed. But he came in and defended the gas and electricity law, in part because he understood that if he didn't succeed in the Court of Appeals didn't go with him on this, didn't go with the state on this, they'd be right back having to fight it the next year, the following year, regarding the Public Service Commission. In fact, in his brief, he says, very unusual, I think, I, the Attorney General of New York State, call to the attention of you, judges on the Court of Appeals, that there are very, very strong implications here for the Public Service Commission's law just passed. And the principle which you enunciate, the decision you make, will be very binding when you consider the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission, brand new, also came in arguing about, I think, the validity of the administrative state and commission regulation. There's a brief in there which is, when I say brief, I mean not brief in the sense of not a lot of pages, because these things would run to 40, 50 pages, but there's a brief in there with some very succinct arguments about why commission regulation and regulatory commissions, the administrative state, this is the wave of the future. And the PSC, as by then the successor to the Gas and Electricity Commission, they were sort of defending their predecessor, but they were also kind of putting a stake in the ground for their own future. And so if you read the briefs with kind of the idea in mind of both backward looking toward the law passed in 1905, now fading and now, in fact, by the end, gone, and the future, Public Service Commission 1907 and future after that, and other similar agencies to come, kind of on the horizon later on, like the Workmen's Compensation Commission. That's the way to look at them. They didn't always put it that way. They didn't always frame it that way, but I think that's the right perspective.
And the court unanimously had I guess, a superficially contradictory result, but it's actually a resounding win for the administrative state, right? Tell me about Chief Judge Edgar Cullen and what the Court of Appeals, what they end up saying about all of this, because it's interesting.
Yeah, Cullen became a chief judge after Alton Parker left in 1904, run for president. And he's sort of middle of the road, but he's more conservative than he is liberal. And he's much inclined to say, look, we've got to look to precedent and we must guard personal liberty. But in this case, he sort of went the other way, and no mean feat, he led the whole court willing. So this is a unanimous decision, which gave it all the more weight. New York State Court of Appeals, and I believe, by far the most important state court in the country, and probably second in importance only to the U.S. Supreme Court. So he wrote at length about why the legislature had the authority, and in fact, he cited some precedents to delegate strong powers to some agency not in the legislature. And he cited a number of court decisions, which he said supported him. If you look at them, I think they're a little more ambivalent than he might have let on. But there's a strong affirmation of the constitutionality of the concept, which has stood the test of time, because the Public Service Commission the constitutionality was never, as far as I know, never seriously challenged. Some of the rulings were challenged, but nobody said after this decision, well, look, this whole concept is unconstitutional. But there was a provision in the gas and electricity law that said that companies, once they had their rates lowered, they couldn't appeal to the commission for review for 3 years. Kind of an odd thing. And Hughes wrote that law, and I'm not sure, and not sure anybody knows why he put that in. Customers could appeal, local governments could appeal, but the the companies couldn't. So Cullen said, look, this is not good. This is unfair. He stopped short of saying that makes it unconstitutional. What he said, again, I think kind of odd, maybe I've misinterpreted something. The legislature should take care of this, easily correctable. By then, the law had expired. There was a new Public Service Commission. And while it didn't explicitly address everything that Cullen was saying here, it did pretty much. In other words, Hughes had written in the Public Service Commission law that if you're a company, your rates are lower, you can appeal. You can appeal right away. A lot of companies did. He had put in sort of a placeholder in the Public Service Commission law. It didn't say explicitly the courts could review, but it said, while the companies are appealing to the commission for review, they may also apply to the courts, and the commission may suspend this ruling while the courts are considering. Well, again, this is a little beyond what we're talking about, but the courts jumped right on it. Companies did too, and sooner or later, a number of cases arose, and the courts got into reviewing PSC decisions, but almost always supporting them. So it was left kind of hanging up in the air. He didn't really say it was totally constitutional. He went like 90% of the way, but he didn't quite say it was unconstitutional. There's a flaw here, not a big deal. Legislature corrected. Legislature already had corrected it. So if you read the decision, it's a very strong affirmation, I think. Regulatory commissions and the administrative state.
No, it's fascinating because it does, as you presented in the article, it really does make fairly clear that the court is saying you can in fact do that. The major issue at stake, the administrative state, is permissible. You just need to write the law better. And well, they've already done that, so it's okay. And as you point out, the Attorney General noted that they had already. I mean, I don't know if he had mentioned that specific issue, but he noted that this law is at stake, and so it seems as though everyone was intentional. Is that right? Everyone, even Cullen, like they know what they're doing here. I think they know what's at stake. Is that fair to say?
I think they know what I know. They know what they were doing. I think they know what was at stake, but maybe I honestly don't. Maybe they're being a little coy. They don't. Cullen was almost a little cagey sometimes. There are other decisions where he stops. It seems to me he stops just short of saying what you'd like him to say, because it would then make it crystal clear. It's pretty clear, but not entirely clear. But yeah, I think they knew what was at stake. They knew what was going on. You know, the judges read the newspapers. They weren't necessarily swayed by the latest trends in public opinion, but sure, they knew what was going on. During the this case was pending, and while the Public Service Commission's law was being debated, Hughes debated John Stansfield, who's one of the counsels in this, in Elmira about Public Service Commission law, and he made a kind of a slip. He said, "We have a constitution, but the constitution is what the courts say it is." And he meant to be saying, look, if these commissions stray, the courts will step in. The Constitution will be interpreted and will prevail. But that came across as, well, the judges are arbitrary. And Hughes tried to walk that back later when he was Associate Justice on the Supreme Court, and then even later than that when he was Chief Justice. But you still see that quoted sometimes. The Constitution is what the courts say it is. That isn't quite what he meant, but it's almost as if the expansiveness of the Constitution and limits on the Constitution would be what the courts say in their wisdom, based on precedent, based on what the lower courts have said and the Supreme Court has said, and so on. In other words, they don't operate in a vacuum. They're very conscientious. And again, just one more quick thing. If you read any of these opinions, and these opinions, by the way, are up online, you can just Google them. Citation after citation, case after case. And sometimes, usually they reach back New York State's own cases, Supreme Court, sometimes other states, and sometimes even England, because that was an important precedent in those days. But there are an awful lot of bases, citations, precedents that they cite and interpret. And of course, they're also selective in what they cite sometimes, too. They kind of ignore things that don't agree with them, and they emphasize things that do.
Well, ultimately, this, I think it's evidence for a statement you made earlier about the significance of the New York Court of Appeals, because as you suggest, it creates this decision, creates a foothold for the administrative state. And you note briefly in the article some of the aftermath, but it also, this emerges from a broader project that you've mentioned and that I mentioned at the beginning, that's forthcoming from SUNY Press, the Crucible of Public Policy.
Right.
And so I want to talk a little bit about someone you mentioned a moment ago, Alton Parker, in a moment. But before we get into Judge Parker, just in a broader way, tell me a bit about the larger scope of that book and that project.
Sure. Well, that book mostly studied the Court of Appeals, so some of lower courts in the progressive era, and I try to look at major policy decisions or major decisions they made affecting policy. And in the research, I discovered or realized many of the public policy issues which you thought were settled in the legislature, they passed law, really weren't settled until they got to the courts. And you sort of thought, well, the Supreme Court was the big player here, and that's all you have to watch. Well, actually, most of the constitutional issues were settled in state courts. Small minority were appealed to the Supreme Court, and of course, if the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, ruled, that was kind of final and definitive. But a lot of this was thrashed out in New York State courts, particularly the Court of Appeals, which I maintain was the one other courts watched. That's why some of the cases that they considered, and that's what I try to cover in the book, were so important. I think once they were settled by the New York State Court of Appeals here in New York, appealing to the Supreme Court, even if that was constitutionally permissible and the Supreme Court were here, people decided not to do that because the Court of Appeals was so good at what they did. They were so authoritative, and they still are. I don't know if it's still true that they're the second most important in the country, which I maintain was true then, and hopefully it was. But it's still a very conscientious court, and it's very authoritative, whether you agree with everything they say and do or not. So New York State Court of Appeals, very prestigious. And one of the points I make is that they were so prestigious that the Chief Judge, Alton Parker, who has been much neglected by historians, had enough stature to get the Democratic presidential nomination and not run a very strong campaign. He was defeated by Theodore Roosevelt, run a campaign. I think it's impossible to imagine that happening from any other state. Maybe it could have, but it sure didn't. And I think it shows how important New York was.
Well, it's interesting, I'm really excited to dig into the entire book when it comes out, I guess at the time of this recording, next month or a few weeks from now. Is that right? No, that's I'm sorry, it's a couple months from now. The other one's coming out next month. But in any case, it aligns in some ways with the one that's coming out in its new form next month, because we know, I think most people who are engaged with this period understand the centrality of New York in policy making and in social reforms and in labor reforms and in all sorts of major things that then became national in scope. And yet you're suggesting here that all or many of those had to be filtered through this Court that had to then, I guess you're saying, signal to the rest of the country that this was indeed something that was legally and constitutionally acceptable, not just a good idea for social justice. Is that basically the
yeah, that's mostly it. Unfortunately, as far as I know, there aren't enough good studies of state courts. A lot on the federal courts, Supreme Court, rightly so, I guess, but not on the states. And so it's hard for me to offer you a lot of documentation in support of my thesis that the other courts watched New York. But I think that happened for a couple of reasons. One is because of New York's leadership, rapid changes here in the economy, growth of big business, immigration, and so on. A lot of the hot button issues got into the New York courts earlier than they got to some of the other courts. And so New Yorkers, now for the first or only time, this is kind of a New York thing, had to wrestle with things first. I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the Court of Appeals then, as I would say now, they were good at what they did. I mean, the decisions they wrote were not always models of clarity. You can certainly understand them. They're worth studying, but they were convincing. They explained things pretty well. So I think that cannot help but have had an influence out across the country. Hard to prove without going into histories of other state courts, which I haven't done. But I think that New York, not just in the courts, but in legislation generally, in progressive period generally, that was one of the 2 or 3 states to watch, along with maybe Wisconsin and a few others. Charles Evans Hughes was one of the leaders to watch, along with Robert LaFollette of Wisconsin and a few others, and Theodore Roosevelt, and then later Woodrow Wilson at the national level.
Well, and as you point out, one of those many New York cases that then became quite significant on the national level in a later iteration is Lochner, and that brings Alton Parker back into the conversation. I think most people are familiar with the U.S. Supreme Court version of that, but you have a chapter forthcoming about how this played out the previous year in New York and Parker's role in all of this. So tell me a bit about that story and its significance.
Well, Lochner versus New York, 1905, as you say, one of the most famous decisions in Supreme Court history. Basically struck down in 1895 New York law regulating the hours and working conditions of bakers. Doesn't seem important, but it was. And that decision was so influential for so many years and so often studied by historians and students that, as you say, everybody knows it. It's very important. If you start looking into that, the fellow who wrote that, the Supreme Court judge, a guy named Rufus Peckham. Well, not everybody knows Rufus Peckham. Well, Rufus Peckham was from Albany. He'd been on the New York State Court of Appeals before being appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I think he knew, he was familiar with some of the other judges on the Court of Appeals, including, I think, Alton Parker. And I think that, can't prove it, because when Peckham died, Parker gave his eulogy and praised him. So the Supreme Court decision overturned a New York State Court of Appeals decision, which was People versus Lochner in 1904, written by Chief Judge Parker. And Parker's opinion, I think, is a better written opinion than Peckham's. I mean, people can certainly judge that for himself. But Parker was kind of a moderate, in this case, for a very progressive opinion, saying, look, this law, which is basically regulating hours, this is more than permissible by the states, just what they ought to do. It's in the interest of the health and welfare of the people of the state, as well as the bakers. It doesn't really contravene the 14th Amendment. This was the hot button issue, which had been passed to protect newly liberated Black Americans in the South after the Civil War, and had a phrase in it, which is also elsewhere in the Constitution and the state constitution, about you can't deprive people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Peckham said you can't deprive bakers and employers of being able to work more than 10 hours without passing a law, without letting them have their say in court, rather. And Parker said, yes, you can. That's not what due process meant. It was meant to apply to a situation after the Civil War, not to restrict or restrain state regulators, state authorities, state reforms. So you can look at the two together and you can compare for yourself. If you look at the way this went, the New York State decision was 4-3. In other words, Parker and 3 of his colleagues in favor of the law, 3 against. The Supreme Court decision was 5-4. If you look at Parker's rationale, it's similar, not the same, but similar to what at least 2 of the dissenters in the Supreme Court said. And vice versa. If you look at Peckham, he's similar to what the dissenters in New York said. Not to say they copied each other at all. Don't mean to imply that at all. But I think they did read and heed each other. So if you take this this case, not even counting the state Supreme Court and appellate court, the votes there, just the New York State Court of Appeals and the U.S. Supreme Court, all told, 9 said yes, I think, and 7 said no, or maybe the other way around. But it was almost evenly balanced. And if you take this further, I think Peckham's reasoning prevailed for many, many years. But eventually it didn't. And if you look way later on, 1937, West Coast Hotel versus Parrish, Charles Evans Hughes, chief judge by then, they uphold that law. It was Washington State minimum hours, so minimum wage law. They use language similar to what Parker used back in 1904, and they kind of shove aside what Peckham said in 1905. So anyway, yeah, once again, one of my points is, look, New York State looms up larger. You can't just say, let's look at this case after it got to Washington. That's important. You have to look at why the legislature in the first place, and then how the state courts handled it.
So you point out that this was part of the rising national prominence of Parker. He is, same year as that case, he's nominated for president. Talk a bit about his, as you say, largely forgotten presidential run. I mean, it's so fascinating because I'm a historian of New York, historian of politics. I couldn't tell you very much about Alton B. Parker. I don't think most people could. So this is a welcome intervention. And part of it, I guess, is this is an era of so many dynamic personalities within New York and national politics, right? He runs against Theodore Roosevelt. Nobody's going to be more exciting than Theodore Roosevelt. He's sandwiched between William Jennings Bryan runs. He's nominated instead of Hearst. He's in New York State right before the rise of Hughes. There's so many other people we forget about Parker, and yet it sounds like you're making the case we ought to take another look at him. So talk about his national rise and then sort of fading.
Yeah, Parker's the only major presidential candidate in history, as far as I know, doesn't have a biography.
Oh, gosh.
Well, as far as I know, there is no biography of Parker. Some people started to write one, and they just didn't get it done. But one of the reasons to look at him is if you're looking at the Democratic Party, one of the 2 great parties then and now, Grover Cleveland kind of a moderate fellow. William Jennings Bryan, pretty progressive and liberal, and so on. Alton B. Parker, kind of a moderate. In fact, he was a friend of Cleveland's, and Cleveland endorsed him. William Jennings Bryan comes back, and then Woodrow Wilson. So the Democratic Party was kind of whipsawed between the, if you will, the conservatives and the liberals in those days. And that's worth studying because the country sort of was on a little bit of a roller coaster too, between sort of, I don't know, laissez-faire, minimum government, minimalist conservatism, and interventionist government, liberals, progressives, and so on. So that's one reason to look at this. Parker ran a front porch campaign. His front porch was in Esopus, New York, down near Kingston. It's the last front porch campaign in American history. It just didn't work. He wasn't well known. People came to see him, but not that many. He got in the newspapers, but not that much. So thereafter, people campaigned much more actively. So that's another reason. But there are a couple of other major reasons. One is if you look at Parker, you look at the campaign documents, the platform and his speeches, which I do in one chapter in the book, they are very conservative. They say, look, we need limited, modest, inexpensive government. Now, Parker, as chief judge, had kind of gone both ways on that. Sometimes he'd been conservative, sometimes more liberal. But the party in 1904, much different from Democrats afterwards, or before that, and much less than the Democrats after that, they were kind of like, look, we're government's expanding too fast. We've got to slow down and be more moderate. There's also a very strong isolationism in the party. And the platform says, look, eventually we have to free the Philippines, which the U.S. had taken over, close the Spanish-American War. It's not right that we're governing them and they don't have constitutional rights. And there's also kind of an anti-militarism strain in it, which is a little bit surprising. 1904, kind of a time of peace. Later, that would have been really out of place as the country is preparing for the First World War. The final reason to look at this is campaign finance. Right at the end, Parker, who had run a very lackluster campaign, didn't really have an issue, suddenly said, look, Wall Street is funding Roosevelt. The trusts are funding him. He didn't have the evidence. He was following the newspapers. He turned out to be right. But Parker was also, Democrats were also getting some big money people to come in. But there were no campaign finance disclosures in those days. So that's, in a sense, where campaign finance disclosure, I think, sort of took root. And Parker talks a lot about the role, the influence of big money in politics. And if you read some of that, that seems very familiar today. So, yeah, I think he is worth another look. I've thought that for years. Actually, I got interested in him way back in my senior year at Hartford College a long time ago, and did my senior thesis on the 1904 presidential campaign. And then, as now, nobody had ever heard of him. Not very many people had heard of him. But while he was a modest, self-effacing, personally guy, didn't like calling attention to himself. I think he left some autobiographical notes in the Library of Congress, but never tried to get a lot of fanfare, and never ran for public office again. Still in all, I think historians would do well to look at him again.
That's interesting. Well, first of all, it's affirmation of something I always tell my students, which is everything you write you don't know if later on you might return to it years down the line and bring the subject up again. And so take every paper seriously. And so something that you wrote decades ago, you're back on the topic again, which is interesting. But I would also say, Parker, you do make him sound like maybe another very Cleveland-like, it sounds like, right? Because sort of what is it, fiscal conservatism, anti-imperial to a certain extent. But the campaign finance thing is interesting.
When Theodore Roosevelt tried to make his comeback, 1910, 11, and 12, one of the things he did is attack the courts. And he attacked the Supreme Court for being too conservative, throwing things out. And he attacked the New York State Court of Appeals for invalidating a couple of laws, including one on workers' compensation. And then he went back. When Roosevelt was in office and the Lochner decision was made, he didn't say anything, not publicly. He went back and attacked the Supreme Court for the Lochner decision, not bothering to say, well, look, it was my 1904 opponent, Parker, who was actually right on this and wrote the decision for the New York State Court of Appeals that wanted to validate this law. So Parker came out almost from, not really in seclusion, but not public prominence, and said, look, Roosevelt is wrong here to denounce the courts. He's the apostle of discord. He's going to be an autocrat. And a number of people picked up on that. So yeah, that's funny, but you're right. One of Roosevelt's theses was J.P. Morgan and big money people got too much influence over William Howard Taft, who was Roosevelt's handpicked successor, but with whom he split and who he's trying to oust from office. So, yeah.
Interesting. You mentioned workers' compensation, and that I believe is a part of your forthcoming book as well. And it actually sounds like an excellent example of what we were talking about before, something where New York legislatively might have been in the vanguard, but it was going to take the courts to, over a much longer period of time, confirm that this was acceptable. If you don't mind talking just briefly about that story.
Sure. Well, beginning of the century, New York didn't have a workers' compensation law. And if you got hurt, or God forbid, killed on the job, some employers had funds from which they would pay you. Some of them carried insurance. Very few workers carried insurance because they couldn't afford it. But often, if you wanted to get a substantial settlement, you had to go to court. Worker had to go to court. And that didn't work out well because it cost too much. It took too long. Again, the courts didn't really want to do it. They didn't have the expertise. And so, again, Charles Evans Hughes said, we've got to come up with something better. He appointed a commission which made a thorough study and made a report in 1910 about what New York should have. They should have a workers' compensation law, meaning employers should have to pay a certain amount depending on the injury, and they based it on, actually, in 1897 English law. Now, the federal government had a workers' compensation law, very weak, I think only for railroad employees, but there were no other states that had this. So New York was first. They passed the law, and when it was signed, when Hughes signed it, again, uncharacteristically, he said, basically, look, I'm not sure this is constitutional. You'll have to go to the courts. And so no surprise, it was soon appealed to the courts, which in 1911 rendered, again, one of those kind of ambiguous decisions. The court says, look, we're sympathetic here. We understand the system isn't working as it is. A lot of this is well within what the legislature could do. But many of the requirements are beyond legislative authority because the Constitution doesn't allow it. So he said, the judge said, the decision said, this is plainly revolutionary. It's unconstitutional. But there's an implication there that if this turned more on the state constitution than the U.S. Constitution. I'm not totally sure why. If the state constitution could only be amended, it might be all right. So, proponents, and by then there's a shift in characters. Al Smith gets involved, and Robert Wagner, Factory Investigating Commission, and so on. And by the way, the Triangle Fire, the tragic Triangle Fire in New York City, which led the Factory Investigating Commission and a lot of labor legislation, that happened the day after this Court of Appeals decision. So anyway, so it's a little different cast of characters. They get together and they amend the Constitution. It takes 2 legislative sessions, a vote of the people. That's done in 1913 under the leadership of Martin Glynn, who would become governor when William Sulzer was impeached and removed from office. And just before the legislature adjourns in 1913, after that constitutional amendment passed, November, Glynn hammers out a compromise new workers' compensation law. And he says to the Democrats in the majority, we better pass this now because in that election, as a matter of fact, the voters had elected a majority of Republicans in the Assembly. So it would be a divided legislature. And that's how the second law passed. It's called workmen's compensation, but now it's called workers' compensation to make it gender neutral. Again, an administrative state agency in a sense. Workers' Compensation Commission, very strong state authority. There's a state fund that employers can pay into. They have to, but it's very advantageous if they do. Rates set for injuries or death or whatever. So probably no big surprise. By the way, the first one had been appealed by an injured railroad worker. The second one was a widow had gotten money when her husband was killed unloading turned out to be a ship in New York Harbor. And the company went to court saying this too is unconstitutional, like the first one was. And the Court of Appeals said, no, it isn't. Look, right here it says in the state constitution, this is constitutional now. It's authorized. And the courts actually took then. So the court ruled in favor of the constitutionality of the commission. The company appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which supported the Court of Appeals. So again, it's not a simple story. I had no idea how complicated it was when I went into it. And it's one of those things that kind of has some zigzags and dark alleys and dead ends maybe, but that's what happened. By the time the second one was passed, other states had time to pass their own, so New York could draw on some of the precedents there. But the New York law became a model for the rest of the country from then on out. And again, Workers' Compensation Board, the location of government has changed some, and the administrative structure has changed some. It's essentially the same laws they passed in 1913.
Wow. Well, so there's so much here that I and I'm sure many reviewers will look forward to digging into all the nuances once the book is available soon. Briefly, you've been so generous with your time, but before we let you go, if it's okay, if we talk a bit about the Spirit of New York, if you don't mind. Now, there's a new edition, expanded edition coming out in February, but I want to ask you a bit about that. But first, since many of our viewers, I mean, if you're watching this program, you may already be familiar with this book. I certainly hope so. And so probably many of the viewers share my appreciation for the specific diverse vignettes you present. And part of what I like about the book, along with the various episodes, is the introduction, which I think is a sort of nice essay about what you call the state's complicated historical mosaic, and the ways, sometimes the challenges of presenting, in your words again, New York in all its vibrant complexity, creative energy, and puzzling contradictions. It's so nicely put. And so I'm wondering, if very briefly, Bruce, you mind talking about taking on a project like this and how you approach such a thing? And then I want to talk a little bit about some of your new examples, if that's okay.
Sure. Well, I grew up in New York, went to school in New York, college in New York, graduate school in New York, and had taught New York State history at 3 institutions, as you indicated. And yet I always felt there's something missing here. It's such a big story. How do you capture it in all this complexity and vibrancy and contradictions? And so I came up with the notion of trying to tell it through a series of stories, not saying this is a textbook. It's not that by any means. There are some good textbooks out there. This is a series of stories based on usually one-day events, what I call pivotal events, by some really interesting New Yorkers. And so in the book, my most interesting character in the book is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, not only for the Seneca Falls Convention, but she kept at it for 50 years. And my second most interesting character is Glenn Curtis, the first air pioneer to fly an airplane at a sanctioned event, public witness, not like the Wright brothers, 1908, a few years later in Hammondsport, New York. So I tried to find some stories about interesting events, pivotal turning points, or something that was resolved issues or had implications for the future, and really interesting New Yorkers there to kind of tell their own story. So I'm trying to let the people, insofar as I'm capable of doing that, tell their own story. Not me, the historian, tell their story, but let them tell it in their own words. So I begin with John Jay and the New York State Constitution, April 20th, 1777. In the new book, there are 19 chapters, but 20 stories, because there's one chapter with 2 stories in it. And I wind up with the opening of the musical Hamilton in New York City in 2015. And as you say, there's awful lot of various diverse examples in there, some political, but some about literature, and there's a chapter in there about the origins of IBM, International Business Machines, which is a New York company, the opening of New York State Thruway, 1954, going back mid-19th century, rescue of fugitive slave in Syracuse, 1851, and so on. And so what I'm trying to do is kind of what you're trying to do in this series, which is get the word out, not just among historians, where even there it's not much known as it should be, but to the general public, the readers. I'm really been trying for years to try to reach teachers in public schools, students in public schools, anybody who might be interested in a good story about what happened in the past. So these are stories. They're not the definitive accounts by any means. They don't try to be. They don't mean to be. If people read the book, hopefully they say, "Oh, this is interesting, and that's really interesting. I'm going to pursue that more." And there's lots of ways of doing that.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's such a useful and productive approach to this. And I will just, for whatever it's worth, for teachers watching, this is a really nice way to make these themes, these big ideas, approachable through these specific stories, and I think it's so nicely written. So I'm and I'm sure many others agree, I'm very grateful for this project. I'm excited that there's a new one coming up. I'll say, I want to get to Hamilton, but I want to say first, when I was a grad student, I think maybe the first or second time I showed up to do research in Albany, already I heard all of the, oh, well, that was lost in the fire. And everybody, every person I ever talked to in the Cultural Education Center has something that they needed that was lost in the fire. Everybody knows that March of 1911 seems to have been a big month. So you've got the court case, and then on the 25th, you have Triangle. And then 4 days later, there's another fire in Albany. Since you spent so much time at the archives, both as a researcher and as a programs director there, tell those who don't know in a very short form the importance of that fire in 1911.
Yeah, actually, that's the chapter in my book that has two events, only a few days apart: the tragic Triangle Fire and the Capitol Fire, which started on a day in March 1911. Nobody's quite sure how, but burned through much of the Capitol, including the old state library, and burned up in the process. A lot of books, some of which were replaceable, but a lot of records, state and colonial government records. That was before there was a state archive, which is a marvelous program where you've done research, and I have too, in the Cultural Education Center. State didn't have an archival program. The state library was authorized to collect historically valuable state government records, done a reasonably good job of it, but the whole area was kind of stuffed full of materials. And so a great tragic loss. Even more tragically, across the street, the new education building, which is now occupied, was almost constructed. It was behind schedule. It had more space to store archives, and it had a vault, a fireproof vault. And so the fire come, I don't know, 6 months or a year later, the material would probably been over there, but it came when it came. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that was lost. In the meantime, up to then, and even before the state archives came along in 1971, New York was the last major state to establish state archives. A lot of stuff was just lost generally. It was thrown out, went to private collectors, some universities, and so on. And so New York's historical record, pre-9/11 in particular, is sketchier than we might wish. On the other hand, the state did a great job for a while in publishing a lot of documents. So there are a number of published documents out, colonial and early national period. But you're right, a lot of stuff was lost, and that's just tragic.
Well, on a hopefully much lighter topic, one of the new chapters for the new edition is on the musical Hamilton and its relation to history. I'll let you talk a bit about that, but actually I'll tell you, I think I mentioned this. As I learned that was forthcoming, I thought about your chapter in the original. It might be the second chapter, but it's an early chapter on James Fenimore Cooper and the Last of the Mohicans, and the presentation of history at that time. So I guess, first of all, how does Hamilton fit into your story? And then maybe if we want to talk about, what these different episodes, centuries apart, tell us about history, culture, memory, how sort of history is presented to the public. But I'll let you tell me your take on Hamilton.
Those are big questions. Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, published in 1826, was, I think, the most widely read novel in the 19th century, well into the 20th century. And when people ask me about this, I say, look, get it down to the library, buy it, read it. Go see the movie if you want to see want to read the novel. It's been made into a movie a number of times, most recently in 1992. But it's about the French takeover of British fort in Lake George, and there's a reconstructed fort there now in 1757, and what happened thereafter, including some of the English and civilians who were with them surrendering and then being brutalized by the French and their allies. And there's a fictional character there who appears in some of Cooper's other novels, in this case called Hawkeye, who's there as kind of the hero. He tries to rescue a couple of women who've been kidnapped. There's a lot of adventure, a lot of hand-to-hand fighting. It's kind of gruesome and graphic for a while. It's very vivid descriptions of the landscape, and it's a good adventure story. He comes across as kind of the, at least for the 19th century, the prototypical American hero. Strong, heroic, undaunted, selfless, never gives up, sort of likes to blend in with nature, is a little bit suspicious of civilization and the cities, and so on. Hamilton, I assume or hope most of your viewers will have either seen in person on TV, or you can actually get the libretto, which is the all of the words out. You know, it's in a book. It is, in a way, it's more fascinating, more complicated. I think so far in this still relatively new century, it's the most famous musical in the new century, and it won every prize that there is to win, including kind of astounding, the Pulitzer Prize. And it's Lin-Manuel Miranda is kind of a genius. Wrote the play, wrote the musical, starred in it, has helped some of the cast, and so on. But if you read what he's written about it, he said, "Look, I went through public schools in New York. All I ever knew about Alexander Hamilton was he's on the $10 bill and he died in a duel with some guy named Aaron Burr." So that's all he knew about it until he read the kind of standard biography of Hamilton and then some other things. And it was like his eyes were open. He said, I was astonished. What a great story. I can tell it. So the first thing that you might draw from this is people ought to know more about Hamilton and a lot of other things than they do. And if they delve into some of the scholarly works, there's the story right there. Pretty easy to get at. So if you look at the play and compare it to actual history, some of it's pretty close and some of it's kind of, well, I took some liberties, and some of it's just kind of made up. But historians' reactions to this was, well, look, all of a sudden Hamilton's in vogue. Everybody wants to know about Hamilton. How did that happen when I've been teaching this or writing about it for years and I couldn't connect with the audience? So this tells us something about how to connect with a contemporary audience. As everybody probably knows, even if you haven't seen the play, it's a very diverse cast. It uses kind of hip hop music. It's constantly emotional, a lot of lively dialogue, a lot of engagement. Not staid history by any means. And there are some things that are memorable about it, including some of the things about New York City. There's a scene in it where the Scholar Sisters, actors playing Scholar Sisters, say, the revolution is happening right now, right here in New York. Hey, that's where things, they'll surprise us, that's where things happen. And there are a couple of other memorable lines where the character playing Hamilton says, "I'm not giving up my shot. I'm determined, I'm young, we're going to go ahead. We're going to overthrow this government, and later we're going to build something new." And there's a line toward the end that says, and I've forgotten who utters this: "Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story?" Well, that's profound if you think about it. And then there's another line which is memorable and people quote it all the time now. History has its eyes on you. Alexander Hamilton, or all of you, or maybe all of us. I think that was quoted by the poet at Biden's inaugural. History has its eyes on you, America. So it's the play is kind of one of those things that kind of bursts on the scene. It's simply brilliant. It has some insights and lessons for historians. I don't think we've totally absorbed them yet. But in another way, it shows what we're doing is worthwhile, because when Miranda started to look into this, well, there were some sources that he could readily draw on. I'm not sure if that really answered your question. That's a kind of in the nutshell.
Well, I think it's great, because I think you point out to a certain extent with Cooper, and certainly in our own time with Lin-Manuel Miranda, they both take liberties. They both, do look at some sources to try and have a presentation of America as a modern, in their moment, American culture, and look to America's history to help America define itself. And in many ways, it then goes well beyond the work of art and becomes a broader cultural phenomenon that endures. But it also then speaks to how historians and others go back and sort of understand these things and present them to the public, and maybe get the public interested. As you have pointed out, a lot of people had been teaching about some of these things for a long time, and then this is a different forum. And I've kept you much longer than I had anticipated, so I'm sorry about that. I hope that's okay.
Well, I love talking about New York history. I'm sort of an advocate for New York history. So no, I appreciate your time and all that you're doing with this series and with the journal New York History, and just generally. So there's no end of studying and writing history, and I guess there's no end, hopefully, of historians like you who are coming on with lots of new ways of thinking and looking at things, and we just have to keep at it. That's all.
Well, I'm so grateful for your time, Bruce, and I will just remind everyone that the article we were discussing will be available in the forthcoming issue of New York History. That is volume 102.2. And some of the stories we talked about today are available in the Spirit of New York, or, like Hamilton, will be in the forthcoming new edition. And I'll remind everyone also to look for the Crucible of Public Policy. Is that the right title? Crucible of Public Policy, forthcoming from SUNY Press as well later this year. I'm so grateful for your scholarship, Bruce, and for your generosity of time and your
thank you.
Enlightening conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. All right.